Yes, it is, guys. It's going to be okay. All right. So you're taking the 2020 AP World History exam. This podcast focuses on the DBQ, the changes, what stayed the same, an exemplar, and then breaking it down a little bit. We'll also be discussing what exactly we're looking for in a good essay according to the College Board rubrics. All right. This is the new rubric released today. So the first thing right off the bat, I want you to notice thesis and contextualization have stayed the same. For your thesis, the formula hasn't changed. You give the time period. You give two significant topics of the prompts that involve a historical thinking skill. These skills and prompt topics form your argument groups, group 1 and group 2, that then become the topic sentences for your 2 body paragraphs. Hasn't changed, guys. The thesis is still answering the question. Your thesis is so interesting, my automatic thought as the reader is, oh, tell me more. An example, within 1900 to the present, 2 significant transformations brought by new technology were the rise of international trade organizations and increased globalization due to the internet. Contextualization is still the big picture. It's how did we get here? You need to give specific historical evidence. That's people, events, places. Give me some names from a previous time period that led to this moment. You've got to connect it. So it can't just be random events. It can't just be, oh, this also happened. You have to show how event A from 100 years ago led to the prompt or event B. Now, this is where things start to change a little bit. Your document usage, once upon a time, or, last month, document usage was worth 2 points. Well, now document usage is worth 3 points. Let's take a look how. If you just used 2 documents, they're labeled Doc 1 and Doc 4. You mention them. They connect to your claim somehow. That's a point right there. However, document support, you can get 2 points for that now. If you use the content, the specific evidence from 2 documents, and you take that and you analyze it and you connect it back to your claim, you've referenced ideas, it's connecting to the theme of the argument, that's a point. You do that for 4 documents, that's another point. For a total of 3 possible points. Now, again, once upon a time, this was 2 points and you had to do this with 6 documents. Now it's 3 points and you have to do it with 4. My recommendation though, guys, you still use all the documents. Only here's the thing, there aren't 7 documents. There aren't 6 documents. There are 5 documents. That's why they're telling you you need to use at least 4 properly to get all 3 points. And don't forget, in AP World History, direct quotes are the kiss of death. They are a waste of time. It doesn't show your reader that you understand the content of the document. You need to put the historical evidence, you need to analyze and put that information in your own words. I don't care what the author of the document said. I care how you're interpreting it. That being said, we are now looking at evidence. What you learned this year was you had to bring in one piece of outside specific historical evidence and connect it to a single document to strengthen your argument, but also to show that you really understood the content of the document. You did that once and it got you a point. Well, now you have to do it again. Do it for a different document. Do it for a second document. Remember, it's got to be a specific piece of evidence, a place, an event, a pattern, something that has to connect to the content of a specific document. If you just happen to mention something willy-nilly, it does not count. But again, now that's worth 2 points. Do it twice, 2 documents. And now, sourcing. In Brenlin, you were taught to CYT by sourcing 4 documents. You had to explain the author's purpose, point of view, or intended audience, or you could give the historical context of a document. Well, now you are specifically looking at the author, the purpose, the point of view, or the intended audience. So you are app. There we go. Your app. You are the app. You had to do that for 4 documents, guys, last year. Well, now you have to do it for 1. Purpose, point of view, or audience for 1 document. That gets you 1 point. Now do it again. So now you have to do it for 2 documents for 2 possible points. But again, this is Brenlin. CYT, y'all. Covey-Atukis. Make sure you do this for at least 3 documents. That way, just in case you're wrong, just in case you really want to go for that unicorn point or the complexity point, this is how you're going to get there. Because despite the changes, the unicorn point hasn't gone away. The complexity point is still there. And that is, as a whole, how coherent, how highly analytical, how full of specific evidence was your essay? Did you use multiple examples of historical reasoning? Did you use multiple critical thinking skills, so multiple arguments? Did you corroborate? Did you contradict yourself but then back it up with evidence? That's what they're looking for. You've seen this document in class before. It's from the helpful phrases, and I really want you to get used to using these phrases in your document to really help you get your point across. When you are introducing what an author says, the author, so we'll just say X acknowledges that. X argues, X believes, X claims, X reminds the reader, X suggests. These are a bit more collegiate. They're highly analytical. They're going to put you on the right path to successfully explain the content of the document. Because here's what they don't do. If you're going to write X acknowledges that, X argues that, you're not going to put that in a direct quote. You're going to put it in your own words. And this is helping you do that because this is how historians write. When you're explaining a quotation, because you will never actually use a quotation, this is how you explain it. So you introduce and then you explain. Basically, the author is saying, in other words, the author believes. The author's point is this. You want to use these phrases. Again, it's putting you on the right path to introducing it and explaining the content without ever using a direct quote. I cannot stress that enough. Direct quotes are the enemy. They are not going to help you. Continuing on with our helpful verbs. When you're making a claim, and that's what you're going to be doing, these are your words: argues, believes, insists, observe, reports, suggests. When you're agreeing, acknowledges, agrees if you want, praises, corroborates, reaffirms, supports, verifies. And when you're questioning or disagreeing, so if you're trying to go for that unicorn point and you want to contradict and back it up, so the author complains, contends, qualifies, questions, renounces, rejects. These are all things that you can use. When you want to admit that maybe there's another point involved, but your claim is better, your claim matters, your claim is right. These are just some phrases that you can use. While it's true that blah, 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 it does not necessarily follow that your argument. On one hand, the author is correct about this, but on the other hand, it's still true that you're right. And then to back that up, establishing why your claims matter. This matters because, and here's the thing, guys, these don't have to be the most eloquent of phrasing, but they're setting you up for the analytical thought process. That's what we care about. I can't dock you for grammar errors. I can't dock you for forgetting to capitalize something. What I can dock you for, though, is if your line of historical reasoning is not your own. If it's taken from a document word for word, if it's not supported by evidence, that's what I'm looking for. And that's what your reader's going to be looking for. Transitional phrases. Again, these are going to help you move from one idea to the next, or for making a contrast, They're going to help you get your point across. So especially if you're comparing and contrasting, these are great verb phrases or prepositional phrases. I don't know. I don't teach AP Lang, but this is what you can use, guys. These phrases will help you direct your line of thought. So if you want to show results, if you want to reinforce an idea, if you're trying to expand upon a point, or if you're trying to concede, and again, you're going for that unicorn point. When you're writing a concluding statement, if you have time, use those concluding words. Wrap it all up. In a perfect world, you'd have time to write a concluding paragraph. But this is AP world. It's not perfect. If you can write a concluding statement, good for you. All right, so now we're going to talk about planning for a DBQ. So this is where I actually want you to pull up the DBQ that I posted for you. Now you have the documents. You have the documents with you, and you have a sample essay. So what I want you to do is go through this and pull out your highlighters. See if you can match up the thesis, the context, documents that support the thesis, aka the documents that ultimately support the claim, a sentence that connects to the thesis, examples of sourcing, examples of outside evidence, complexity points, again, the unicorn point, and also looking at topic and or concluding sentences that tie into the thesis, and that really supports the essay flowing. So what I want you to do is take a minute, look at your sample essay, and for the first paragraph, I want you to highlight the contextualization, and I want you to highlight the thesis. What I'm going to do is read through this with you, follow along if you want, and then pause it, do your highlighting, and then see where you fit in. So in both Japan and Russian industry changed drastically between 1850 and 1914. Japan had recently overthrown the Tokugawa shogunate and made the Meiji emperors head of state, while in Russia, the Tsar still ruled from a position of enlightened despot. But there was a shift away from the traditional serf-based economy. Both countries fell behind to Western powers and were being exploited economically as a result. The only solution was for both empires to industrialize and become more Western. Although both Japan and Russia quickly began industrializing after the mid-1800s through government investment to compete with Western superpowers, ultimately, the difference in working conditions created vastly different outcomes in government choice. So at this point, pause it, take a few minutes, and begin highlighting what you think is contextualization and what you think is thesis. And then we're going to go over it in just a moment. So pause it. At this point, we're going to move on. So this is what it should look like. You have your introductory statement. Nobody cares. But right away in yellow, you're going to look at your contextualization. Those are specific events that had to happen for industrialization in Russia and Japan between 1850 and 1914. So you do have to have some background knowledge concerning the prompt. And what we're seeing here in background knowledge, contextualization knowledge, Japan overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate. Russian czars still ruled, but there's a shift from traditional serf-based economy. We know that happened. I believe that was Alexander the Second. The third freed the serfs, ended up getting assassinated. And that's what we're looking at is what else is happening. We know how the Meiji Restoration happened in Japan. We know Commodore Matthew Perry showed up, told Japan, you will trade, or else Japan had to. But what they're going to do in the meantime is westernize very quickly. And then we also have our thesis. Japan and Russia quickly began industrializing through government investment to compete with superpowers. That's a similarity. So right here, similarity, historical thinking skill 1. Right down here. Ultimately, the difference in working conditions created vastly different outcomes. That is similarity, difference, compare and contrast. That is our second historical thinking skill. But we also have our two topics that will lead to our two document groupings that are then going to lead to our two body paragraphs. So let's take a look at the second body paragraph. So again, I'm going to read this. Feel free to follow along. To combat European superiority, Russia and Japan seeked to get on the same playing field via industrialization. In document 1, Sergey Witt writes, now the transition from a serf economy to private investment has created growth in Russian industry. However, as the Russian finance minister, it is possible he is exaggerating the letter to the Tsar to get his favor. This changes the purpose and the facts of the document. This government-sponsored move to industrialization also happened in Japan, where the Meiji government established various factories for iron, machines, and silk. Document 2 expresses the views of Count Okuma, who says young men were sent to Western nations in an effort to learn about the industrial revolutions. Historically, this process is analogous to Peter the Great's westernization in Russia, where he toured Europe in an effort to modernize his country by observing European practices. The process led to the adoption of Western traditions in Japan, like paper money and banks for foreign trade. However, the purpose of Document 2 could be biased, as it was published in a U.S. paper by a former Japanese prime minister, making it possible that all of the reform he talks about is just propaganda and not true. Either way, both documents show how the Russian and Japanese governments cared about making their countries competitive through industrialization. Document 3 furthers this claim by showing a photo of a Japanese silk factory. It looks very similar to Western assembly lines, proving how the Japanese government incorporated Western techniques into its own industry. Although many Japanese saw Western culture as inferior, they still incorporated it into their daily lives while keeping their beliefs intact. Something evident in a document where Japanese women wearing kimonos are generating machines in a silk factory. Finally, Document 6 illustrates the amount of growth in Russia after industrialization by using natural resources. This proves the economic benefits from industrialization were apparent in both Japan and Russia. Indeed, the merchant's point of view in the document makes Pavel Berkashin more qualified to write about the economy, enhancing the quality of the source. Russia and Japan invested heavily in industrialization to provide economic growth in their countries. All right, so again, we're looking at our prompt. To what extent was industrialization similar in Russia and Japan between 1850 and 1940? So here, what you're going to be looking for are documents that support the thesis. You're going to be looking for sentences that tie to the thesis. Is there any sourcing? Do you see outside evidence that connects to a document? And finally, do you see any complexity points? So what I want you to do is, again, pause it, get those highlighters out, and see what you think. Feel free to pause. We have now unpaused. This is what we're looking at. So in pink, documents that are supporting the thesis. So anything in pink, and that's quite a bit of this, is evidence from the document that is explained. One thing you don't see in this entire paragraph are any direct quotes. They don't exist. The author of this essay has taken the time to break down the content in his own words and connect it back to the argument. So he talks about how government-sponsored moves to industrialization in both Russia and in Japan. And he's actually sourced 3 of the documents in here. So he talks about the point of view of the Russian finance minister, the purpose of the former Japanese prime minister, and the point of view again of a merchant. So you can use the same part of HIP, or app as we're calling it now. You can use the same component more than once. That is perfectly fine. We also see an example of outside evidence. So document 2 talks about how young men were sent to Western nations to learn about the Industrial Revolutions. And Peter the Great did this too. It's not just that he sent people, he himself went undercover to learn about European practices. That shows your reader that you understand the content of the document, but also that you have a greater understanding of the themes of world history and the events of world history. Sentences that tie to the thesis is just going back to showing a solid understanding of the documents. And right here, we actually have a direct comparison of the documents. Both documents show how the Russian and Japanese government cared about making their countries competitive. All right, same thing for paragraph 3. I'm going to read it, and you're going to look for the same components again. The major difference between both, so that's both Russia and Japan, was their treatment of workers. Russian factory workers were treated poorly and often protested. Document 4 details one of these protests regarding factory conditions and how the workers' strike brought tears to the eyes. However, as a socialist, his purpose would be to negatively portray factories, an indispensable part of the capitalist machine. He could have exaggerated his account to get more support for the communists, making the source's claims disputable. This document makes it clear that Russian factory workers were fed up with working conditions, something furthered by document 7. It details how women and children are treated poorly, and after protests are often fired and replaced with younger girls. Those who asked for pay raises were brutally denied pay. The terrible working conditions of factories ended up supporting the Bolshevik thought that suffering is caused by capitalism's greed. The poor treatment of workers eventually contributed to the overthrow of the Tsar and a change to a socialist communist state. Meanwhile, in Japan, workers were generally happy, something proved by document 5. Around 90% of workers were glad that they worked in a silk factory. The lack of resentment surrounding factories in Japan contributed to a more stable government than Russia. The differences in working conditions created 2 different governmental outcomes in Japan and Russia. So again, you're going to pause this, get those highlighters back out, and go through docs supporting the thesis, sentences that tie to the thesis, sourcing, outside evidence, and complexity if you think it's there. So pause it. And we have now unpaused. And this is what it should look like. So again, we're looking at no direct quotes. We're looking at taking the document and putting it in your own words, explaining the content and how that connects to your argument. Only one document is sourced here. So the person who wrote this sourced 4 documents, only had to do 3. All of the documents, however, are sourced correctly. Literally the only complaint that I have about this essay is when you're identifying a document, you really should identify it or at least mention it by the author. So you could put author's name and then document 4. And that just provides a bit more clarity when you're talking about the author's purpose or point of view. But again, it's not required. This paper got a 7 out of 7. What you can also see here, though there is no outside evidence, that was only required once, so we're good. But we see some complexity as well. So going above and beyond, what we're looking at is, as a result, what happened to the government, what happened as a result of industrialization. And essentially what happened in Russia is these terrible factory conditions ended up leading to the rise of the Bolsheviks and the end of the Tsars as we knew it. What we're seeing is a deep rise of nationalism in Japan, as most of the factory workers, as we know that makes up a lot of the population, were happy and content with their jobs and where they were in life. That's going to lead to a very stable government, a lot of loyalty, and again, that increase in nationalism. And finally, paragraph 4. Rapid industrialization was a feature of both Japan and Russia, using government investment, but each one had a different approach to workers, which ultimately created different outcomes. Both wanted to rapidly expand and become challengers of other superpowers, and through government spending and infrastructure, achieved rapid economic growth. However, Russia's poor treatment of its workers laid the seeds for communism, while Japan remained stable. So take a second and pause it and figure out which part of the key this is. All right, you should have unpaused it by now. And if you guess thesis, you'd be correct. This is just restating the thesis and going a little bit above and beyond. And this is how you conclude. You just restate the thesis. A little longer here, a bit of evidence, and that is a 7. So what are we looking for? Hang tight, guys. It's going to take me a few minutes to read. What are we looking for? A good response would draw on 6 or 7 documents. That is, all of them are all but one. Right now, that would be 4 or 5. To present a comparative analysis of industrialization in Japan and Russia between 1850 and 1914. Given the thrust of the question, the thesis should address both similarities and differences in comparing Japanese and Russian industrialization within the particular time period noted. An example of a good thesis might state that in both Japan and Russia, the government played a significant role in the promotion of industrialization, though the former relied upon domestic capital, while the latter was dependent upon foreign sources of investment. The analysis of the documents should provide evidence to support the thesis or relevant argument. In addition to using evidence from at least 6 documents to support the thesis or argument, the essay should explain the significance of the author's point of view, purpose, audience, or its specific historical context for at least 4 of the documents. For example, in discussing document 1, you might argue that the secret nature of Witt's letter increases its reliability as evidence of motivations and character of Russian industrialization. Or in discussing document 3, you might question the veracity of the evidence from the photo by a foreign photographer of Japanese working conditions. A strong essay will consistently and cohesively address the reliability of the evidence that supports or contests the stated thesis. However, a strong essay does not simply list the characteristics of one document after another. It makes connections between documents or parts of the documents to corroborate evidence that is used to make compelling arguments. And you actually saw that in the first body paragraph, where the author discusses both of these documents. So we'll go back to that. Either way, both documents show how the Russian and Japanese governments cared about making their countries competitive through industrialization. Witt's letter and Akuma's article. Let's talk about that for a minute. These are used as evidence to corroborate and insert a claim of difference in that the Japanese raised and concentrated capital internally by issuing bank regulations and establishing national banks, while the Russians did so through the influx of foreign capital. You can also discuss the labor conditions. In the document-based question, students are required to use outside examples and knowledge to support their stated thesis or relevant arguments. Both of the aforementioned arguments concerning differences between Japanese and Russian industrialization can be supported by knowledge beyond the documents at hand. Students may point out Russian industrialization in the late 19th century relied heavily on foreign capital. Witt's reforms liberalized rules related to foreign investment. His moves to bring Russia into the gold standard and to stabilize the ruble also attracted foreign investments. In Japan, by contrast, state-guided industrialization was financed almost entirely by the government or private Japanese investors. In terms of workers' willingness to assert their rights and grievances, students might establish in their response this was more pronounced in Russia, where urban workers eventually instigated the Bolshevik Revolution, while in Japan, even strikes were rare prior to the 1920s. In both examples, the inclusion of knowledge that extends beyond the documents strengthens the argument about difference and demonstrates an appreciation for the nuances of historical thinking. And finally, a strong response also demonstrates an understanding of the broader context of issues relevant to the question, and it situates the thesis or relevant argument within a larger historical context. In this case, a comparison of industrialization in Japan and Russia could be situated within a discussion of larger, relevant global processes, such as modernization, or response to global industrial capitalism or Western European imperialism. All right, guys, that's what we got for how to DBQ a review for the 2020 exam. It's going to be okay, guys. You know I believe in you, and you know you got this. Have a great night, y'all. Cheers.